All right, this is someday in March, the 14th, actually. Almost the Ides, right?
Yes.
Almost the Ides. And this family law, it's March 14th. I already said that. And today, as we move to the 10th chapter in the book, the 10th subject, I will remind you that there is no assignment over the next 2 weeks. And next week is spring break. However, there is a quiz over 8, 9, and 10. And it's not due though for like 2 weeks, so that's pretty good, right? You don't have to do it until the Tuesday we come back, and we'll take up illegitimacy and paternity when we get to that point. And so that's where we are. And today we're going to move out of some of the more family law, like divorce and child custody issues or paternity issues, into the legal rights of women, which, if you remember, we already kind of talked about this in the first chapter because of the importance, really, of the whole body of law comes out of the fact that when we got rid of the unity of person, which, what was that again? Unity of person.
Where the wife had no legal rights and she assumed the identity of her husband, basically.
Right. So as soon as a woman was married, then she got only the rights that basically we decided that her husband will let her have. Okay. Isn't that kind of weird? I mean, the law kind of established that point, but that's what happened. So because when the unity of person breaks down, or that concept in the law, which is a good thing, it's good that it broke down. We see you made it. Good. Thanks for coming. And when that breaks down, we find good things happen. And part of it was one you'll notice it's on this list, and that's women's suffrage, right? That happens. And guess what happens once you have women's suffrage? What is women's suffrage?
Right to vote.
The right to vote. Then it's a participation in lawmaking, right? Really, up to that point, you kind of don't have very many rights as a woman in terms of lawmaking. Okay, so kind of interesting things, and we could go into a history of, whether or not women's suffrage was actually a creation of women or men, right? I don't know if you know any of the history on that, and maybe some revisionism of that. But in any event, there's some history that we won't really worry about. But with women's suffrage, we get more lawmaking, or at least that policy perspective, that policy issue. So that's kind of like why we talk about women's rights in this class, because it's the foundation, really, of the need for family law as its own subject matter. Okay, before this point, we didn't really have much in the way of divorce. We had our concerns really had more to do with inheritances, and remember that whole area we like to use the old term sometimes, but illegitimate children and things like that, we like to use that language. That was what it came out of. It really had very little to do with family law as we know it today, because it was about heredity, and then if you go back through time, that's really about the nobility and all that stuff. So anyway, that's why when you talk about legal rights of women, I think this is right in the beginning of the chapter, and I think it's worth pointing out. This is a case from 1872, and there's some language. There's another interesting case language that you'll see that we'll talk about briefly a little bit later. But in 1872, the U.S. Supreme Court says that man is or should be woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The Constitution of the Family Organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and function of womanhood. The paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. Okay? So that's the U.S. Supreme Court in 1872, saying, well, yeah, it makes sense, right? That's what the law is. Okay, we've come a long way, baby, right? Okay, so with that, okay, we come way far from that point in time. We get women's suffrage. When about do we get women's suffrage, by the way? Okay, so we get it in the 20s. What also was happening in about 1921? Prohibition, right? Kind of interesting correlation there, maybe. So when we go from there, we start to have a whole new status of women. And the unity of person goes away. And basically what we figure out is that you get all these rights that I love how the book puts it. The book says all of these things, it would offend most women to tell them that you know you have that right. You have the right to make your own will. A married woman, by the way. Some unmarried women didn't have any problem. They could. You got more rights as an unmarried woman. You have your right to own your own property. You have the right to enter into a contract, to be a juror, to vote. Sue someone, be sued, execute a deed, keep your own earnings. What? Keep your own earnings? Preposterous, right? But all of that stuff, I mean, that's a natural to us today, right? I mean, that's like makes sense. There's not a lot there. So let's get into the law of it a little bit. We had two protections in the law that are related to each other. You've heard the terms of dower and courtesy, right? Okay, courtesy was a little bit less important. Normally, I'll tell you that why in a minute. But what is dower? Dower is the general concept that it's the right of a surviving wife. I combine the two terms. To the lifetime use of 1/3 of all the land of her deceased husband that he acquired during the marriage. Okay, a life estate in only 1/3 of the property. That's the dower interest. Okay, in some states, Ohio, for example, a married husband must have his wife also sign a deed to get rid of her dower rights. That's still today. It's the law in Ohio that if I own property, let's say I'm a married man and I own a piece of property in my own name in the state of Ohio, if I go to sell it, to transfer it to somebody else, I also have to have my wife sign it to waive her dower rights. We're in the forefront in West Virginia. We don't have that. Huge, right? But what's also odd to me is that in a deed in both states, we specifically indicate your marital status in your deed. Right at the front. The party of the first part, you ever hear that crappy language?
Oh, yeah.
The party of the first part is so-and-so, a unmarried or married. Like if we say that, we still say widowed and widower. You're a widower. No, we still put that in there. Okay? We put that in. Why in the world do we do it? It's the best law there ever was. We did it before, so we do it again, right? Or that's the way we've always done it. It's the best law there ever was written. Let's do it the same way as we did yesterday. So we still do it in West Virginia. We do it in Ohio. In Ohio, it actually matters a little more because you do have to sign away your dower right. Okay. On the flip side of that, we get the courtesy, which is the husband's right to what? A life estate in all of the land that she owned during the marriage, only though if there's a child of the couple, to the couple. Okay, that makes sense, right? What's the concept? Why is it that the husband gets this during the life as long as there's a kid? That he has to make up for the fact that there's not mom at home, right? Wife and mother role is gone, so we're going to help out husband, right? Do we really help out wife? No, she can fend for herself. We say she's not capable to, right? What was it again? The timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for the many of the occupations of civil life, but will let her fend for herself. Right? Kind of interesting, I think. But it goes along with the unity of person. He gets all of that because that's the idea, right? Okay. So for most states, so you haven't heard of curtsy because it isn't as common. In Ohio, you don't waive it. It's not like it hasn't been a thing probably for 100 years, but it's not there. It's not a big issue. We don't see too much of it. You've heard of dower because there's dowries, right, and all that stuff. That's a different kind of dower. It's dowry, right? That's where the family pays to the husband to marry the daughter, right?
Yeah.
You know, that's the whole thing. Okay, but so I said in West Virginia, we don't have dower, right? We still don't talk about the dower, right? What changed? What changed is a new concept known as the elective share, okay? So down here, we have a concept in law known as the elective share, okay? What has changed? What is this right, really? Only when there's a death, right? So what we're probably changing with elective share is the concept of your inheritance, all right? So we'll say basically the concept of dower and curtsy was we wouldn't leave a spouse, a widow or a widower, you know, destitute. That's the concept. Okay. The other thing you couldn't do was, unbeknownst to your wife, you couldn't get rid of all your property or mortgage all your property and leave her with nothing. Okay. We call that disinherit your spouse. We don't let you do that. Okay? We don't let you do that. You can try, and as long as your spouse doesn't contest it, you can get away with it, right? Which there are times that's necessary. Okay? It's something we do because we've arranged it otherwise. You can do it as part of an agreement to make a will in a prenuptial agreement. Okay? You can make an agreement to make a will where you say that you will disinherit me because we might have children of a prior marriage or relationship, right? And we don't want you to inherit from us in that manner. Okay, so we're talking about inheritance and an elective share. What do you think the elective share is?
A specific amount that goes to the living spouse, the remaining living spouse.
Right. So if you die and you're unmarried, you owe at least a certain minimum amount of your estate to your spouse, your surviving spouse. That's what elective share is. In every state, there's a statute that says that doesn't matter what the will says, the surviving spouse can elect a share. Okay? It depends on a couple of factors, one of which has to do with whether there's a child of the marriage. Okay? The first thing is if there's a child of the marriage, the surviving spouse gets half. Okay? That's the elective share. If there is not a child of the marriage, or there were children that were prior to the marriage of the deceased person, you only get a third. Okay? And then the remaining 2/3 or the remaining half go to the kid, right? Or pursuant to the terms of the will. Okay, so kind of interesting point in law, right? So with that said, do we really need dower and curtsy? No, we don't, right? So why in the world does Ohio hold on to it?
Why did anybody?
We just never know. They thought Buckeyes were not poisonous nuts and they were eating them, right? The Ohio Revised Code only has odd number chapters. Yeah, I don't think we have any more questions to ask, right?
We're the crazy ones.
So, why do they hold on to it? I don't know. I think it's that old law, the best law that was ever written. It's because that's the way we did it yesterday.
Right.
And I suppose because common law holds on hard, it's a tough thing to get rid of. Without specifically putting it in a statute, we're never going to let it go. I don't know. What's odd to me, in particular, when it comes to deeds, is that in Ohio, there's a statutory form for deeds, and in West Virginia, there's a statutory form that is a lot less modern. So I think that's weird because Ohio went to this really modern standard form for deeds, and West Virginia has an old one, and one of them gets rid of an old right and one of them doesn't. I just think it's odd as you go, because Ohio went into some all different kinds of deeds and things. I know this isn't property law, but all kinds of different types of deeds transfer on death 10 years, 15 years before West Virginia did. Okay, so just points of information. So anyway, why did they do it? I don't know. I just was asking if you had an idea. Okay, another area that has to do with the legal rights of women has to do with changing your last name, right? So we know, you know this, right? That generally speaking, women and men get married and the woman takes the man's last name, right? Pretty common. Why? Why do they do that? History, tradition, right? Do they have to? No. Do they have to do anything to change their name?
Well, marriage license.
Well, the marriage license documents that process, but it's not officially a name change. A marriage license indicates your maiden name,
Right.
right? That's what it indicates.
But I thought that's the document you had to use to prove the name change.
It proves the reason you started, probably the date you started using it, because you have usage. Okay, because when you were married, common law says you can change your name by using the new one. That's it. You change your name by using it. How do you do it? You have only one. It's exclusive is the first element of usage. You have only one new name. I suppose you could have a hyphenated name, but it's still just one new name, right? And it's consistent. You always use it. And it's not for a fraudulent purpose. Why do people sometimes change their names? Right, to get out of legal trouble, mostly money, right? Why do people normally assume new identities? They're either criminally responsible or something, or some goons with crowbars are after them, and they assume a new identity, right? Let's call the goon of today the creditor bank that has your credit card, right? We change our name, we assume a new identity to defraud our creditors. Sounds great, doesn't it? So I suppose people have done worse when they get married. And use worse reasons. But you change it by using the new one. Okay, what about those people out there? And I know plenty. There are a lot in the legal profession, a lot of doctors, a lot of people that have professional licenses that go by a different name, right? They are married, and in their social circles, they're known as Mrs. last name of their husband, right? In professional circle, they're known as their maiden name. Doctor, lawyer, so-and-so, right? What about them? Is that consistent? Are they consistently using the new name? Sure they are, right? They're consistently using it professionally and consistently using the new one socially, right? Don't you agree?
It sounds like you were saying half and half. I mean, they were.
That's consistent.
Is it?
Sure.
Really, 50-50?
I don't know if 50-50, it's still consistent.
Oh, I get you.
Is more than half your time social or professional? I don't know.
I would say it's more professional than social.
I don't know. It's hard to tell. Hopefully, I wish that mine was more social.
Right. That's the way it is.
Wish more of my time went to the fun part, right? The awkward social parts, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's go with that. So anyway, you have those problems. Well, I think it's the same. I mean, I think it's consistent. And the problem is that you're allowed to use your old name as long as you want. It's still your name. And professionally, it's kind of annoying. You're not like misrepresenting who you are by using your maiden name. Most people, they earn their law degree, their medical degree, whatever they're using They earned it. Maybe they started a business and built a business as a particular name. They're not going to change it, right? They're going to use their maiden name for that purpose and carry it forward, even if they get married and they decide to change it legally for, they change their social security number. Their social security number, that's a little bit illegal, maybe. I suppose you can get it changed. Your name for your social security card. You change your name on your license and all of those kinds of things. It makes sense, right? The most important thing you need to know is that you do not have, there's no law that says you change your name when you're married. You do that by use, okay? It can actually be complicated. I think nowadays to get a new license, and I think women certainly got the short end of the stick when it came to license changes and all the renewals and all that, because now you got to take every document that ever proved what name you ever had.
All the way back to the birth.
And so that's pretty tough. Okay, so that's one way we change it. That's the most common way. We also have statutory name changes that basically follow the same three rules, that you can't do it primarily. You go to court, you file a name change application, you change your name to about anything you want. Okay? I've seen some interesting ones. There's a guy who has routinely been a felon in Wood County that I'm aware of, that his name is the letter R, space, the letter U, space, out of it. That's his name. I forget what his brother's name is. I'm with. Anyway.
No, you are stupid.
That's his wife.
Well, in any event, people can have lots of different names. There's been some interesting ones. One that relates to, all kinds of names. People want to have all kinds of names. You generally can't steal somebody's name. I was going to say Ronald McDonald, but then I was thinking of the Taco Bell commercials for breakfast when they had all the Ronald McDonald people, right? But you can't really steal somebody else's name in that way. Those people, that's their name. But you can't do things like that. In some cases, I think we've actually had some that they did get it where you can become a corporate name if you can get paid and change your name to Converse or whatever, right? Okay, so there's all kinds of interesting ones. Any event, you can do it statutorily. You can't do it for a fraudulent purpose. And basically, it has to be some acceptable name. Okay? All right. So, any questions about those things? I don't know. They're interesting questions. Now, the next area I find to be an issue that a lot of people aren't really aware of, and that is, how does gender play, or really, let's say, the hiring process and the employment process play, and how does gender play in those areas?
We're very, very watchful these days and very strict on how employers are to treat both sexes. It has to be equitable, and if it's not, there are severe ramifications for it.
Right. There's something called the Equal Opportunity Act, right? That designates how many people your candidate, your candidate pools and some of those kind of things. They're watched at a very general level, okay? We used to there was something called the Equal Rights Amendment. Do you ever heard of that? Equal Rights Amendment. It didn't make it, okay? But it actually drew particular lines, and said this many people are different. Not only is sex isn't the only protected class. There are lots of them. Race, religion, the ones we know generally, okay?
Right.
So the problem in employment is making sure that you're not discounting gender and not qualifying people for positions based on their gender, okay? That's a big factor. Why do we have that? Where does the protection come from when it comes between the sexes? Where does it come? Where's the law that comes from?
Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay, so we have a federal law that says the Civil Rights Act goes back quite a ways, right? 1963, Civil Rights Act, 1963 and 4. Okay, it's been amended, right? But where does it get its authority? Where does the federal government get its authority to create the Civil Rights Act?
Does it go back to constitutional rights?
Sure. Which one?
The 14th Amendment?
Which part of the 14th Amendment? There's different parts. There's a due process part. That's probably not the one you mean.
Where everyone has equal right under the law to have.
We don't call it equal right.
Sorry.
Equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. You got it though. You were there. You just said a different word because we know it as equal protection. But equal protection under the laws, right? So we get that out of the amendments, right? That's a constitutional principle that there is equal protection of the law between the genders, right? And then how do we apply that? Well, we misconstrued it probably for a few years because that's what we always do in law. Or maybe not we applied it as we saw fit. Let's go with that. And then eventually the Supreme Court said we were seeing fit the wrong way. And then we get the Civil Rights Act, which is a good thing. There were a lot of questions about whether or not they could even, delegate to the states what they could do, or not dictate to the states what they could do. Anyway, you get that point. So how can you use, I think there's some good ones. How can you use gender? Can you draw a line between the genders in employment?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, well, you can't, but you can't, only to a degree.
Yes, only to a degree, not outright. You can't just automatically be like, only men are qualified for this job,
No.
and only women are qualified for this job.
There are workarounds.
There are workarounds. There's only one big one, right? And it's called the bona fide occupational qualification, the BFOQ. Okay, what does it basically say? The essence of the business is undermined by not following that qualification. Okay, that's it. Got it? That's it. It undermines the business. You know how many cases that falls into? Like almost none.
Right.
Any ideas how businesses get around this concept? Let's say we're going to go work at a warehouse. How do they get around it at the warehouse? They don't not hire women to work there, right?
Right.
What do? What's your job qualification?
You have to be a weight limit? Is there a weight specification?
Yeah, not how much you weigh, but how much you can lift and move, right? You must be able to, you've seen this in job postings probably, must be able to move 80 plus pounds repetitively during the day, right? But all I was going to do was file papers in the...
The post office was like that too at one point, because I thought about taking the civil service exam and you had to be able to lift so much.
Right.
It was crazy, but
Well, you have to be able to lift a lot.
you do there.
Were they really, so in the end, and Marissa says, you're not qualified to run a forklift or lift things, right? So you could say you can't go to the, there's other ways to do it. Does that really mean that it's a gender basis for it? Is there a gender bias? There is in practicality, right? Tends to be men can lift more things, pick things up and put them down, right?
Unless you're motor
Right?
Oh, God.
But that tends to be, that doesn't mean it's for everyone. It just means like we tend to think that. There are plenty of people who can't pick up very heavy things. Do people, as Marissa points out, do you think more men or women have been qualified to operate forklifts? There's probably more men. That doesn't mean that they're more magically able. It just means that they tend toward it more, right? So when a business puts those kinds of things out there, are they really being gender discriminatory? What do you think?
No.
At one time, let's go with yes, right?
Right.
Certainly right after the Civil Rights Act comes out and they're like, there's this bona fide occupational qualification. Guess how many businesses that were traditionally men only became undermined by the requirement to treat the sexes the same. Okay, at one time that probably was true. There's always a workaround early on. I don't think today I think they really don't want people who can't lift a bunch of weight if you're going to work at UPS and throw boxes around, right? I don't know if that's true in every case. Trust me, there are plenty of cases that happen all the time on these kinds of issues. You know, good or bad or ugly, right? I don't think most mean to. I think most, you know why they put those in their posting? Because they did that before.
Yeah.
My favorite law, right? I love that law. You got the copy, you Googled it. I needed to put a job posting out. It mentions that, so I put it in mine, right? Steal liberally. And not in the, yeah, I better be careful. Don't steal, that's illegal. Use open source things
Open source.
liberally.
That's the legal way.
I don't know.
Sources.
Cite your source at the bottom of your job posting.
Oh, my word.
Yeah, in APA format. Okay. Not for me though. Don't use APA. Somebody else cares. All right. So I think we know this stuff, right? You know there are potentially illegal questions. Really, your employer's not allowed to ask if you're married. What is your maiden name? Do you have children? Do you have child care? Can't ask if you'd want to be called Miss or Mrs., right? Just answer Ms. MS.
Yeah.
Do you know the MS, if you get to the wrong generation, that meant, or not the wrong generation, that's an older generation, that meant, no, it meant that you were widowed. And so you wouldn't want to be called that, but today, MS is the common one that we use for people we don't know, and it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, there's no Mr. or Mr., right? I mean, there's not a different one. So Ms. is what's used commonly when we don't know, right? Shouldn't we just use the standard one? Problem. I don't know. So what's interesting in these questions is there are lots of ways around this, right? A common one is, what do you like to do in your free time? I really like youth sports, right? Like, I like to go hang out with my kids at the park, right?
Okay.
Is that really asking whether or not you're married or
No.
you have kids? No, it's
But
not.
it's getting the answers.
It's getting the answer. But isn't it have a worthwhile purpose? I mean, don't you like to know, like, somebody comes in, like, what if everybody in a workplace, you know, we're looking for feel, and like everybody loves sports a lot. They're like, oh, we love sports, all we do. We're always talking about sports when we're at the water cooler, right?
Oh, my word.
Okay, sports are awesome. The rest of the paper's worthless. And we ask you, like, what do you do in your free time? I don't really like sports. You know, like, is
You're
that's a fair question, isn't it? What do you do in your spare time? I like to work on my house. That's what I do. That's all I do, for that matter. Right? Okay, you get the idea. I'll tell you that when I first, a job that I interviewed for, I actually had a judge ask me if I was married or had a girlfriend. Like, and he premised the question with, I'm pretty sure I'm not allowed to ask this, but I'm going to anyway. That's what he said. And then the purpose of the question was interesting because I'm thinking, oh, you can't ask that, and you know you can't ask that, but you're going to anyway. And I was desperate for a job more, so I wasn't like going to bring it up, right? But it was because, oh, the ladies in the office like to set up the person. Yeah, that was the reason for the question. I thought,
Sure.
what was he asking for? Fit with the office, right? He did it the wrong way. I'm not saying he should have asked about my girlfriend or whether I had one, right? I don't think he should have done that. But he could have asked me what I like to do. Do I like to go on a lot of dates? I mean, I guess that wouldn't be a proper question. But lots of things are interesting, you know. Some of the factors that play in, you know, you're not allowed to ask if somebody's pregnant. Or like you think, you're like pregnant, or you think you're gonna be pregnant, right? You're not allowed to ask that kind of stuff. What's a valid business decision though, isn't it? Like the fact that someone's gonna be gone from employment for a period, right? That's a business. Do what?
Unpaid family, 12 weeks of family.
Well, I mean that part, or what if your leave policy says that you get paid leave right? Should you get that? I mean, it's a good business, but you can't ask it. Okay, you can't be like, But I'll tell you, a lot of employers get like burned on that. They're like, what? They're like, first day on the job. By the way, I'm going to be out in March. But that's it's an interesting point, right? So it's something you want to ask, but you can't ask. Okay. So along those lines, we already talked about the FMLA, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act. Does everybody know what Family and Medical Leave Act is? That's basically where in the U.S. it's a federal law that says that you are entitled to take off and have your position held for a period up to 12 weeks in every 1,260-hour work period, basically. What's that mean? About every 12 months, you can have 12 unpaid days off work, or months off, weeks off work. Let's go with that. Okay, you can do that for family or medical leave issues. Okay, what's family? The most common we know is the pregnancy one, right? That's when most people know about family and medical leave, but it also comes into play with a lot of other factors. If you have a sick family member and you need to take off work. But all FMLA does for you is give you your position to be held for that period of time. Yeah, Marissa points it out, it's a hot topic during the election because people want paid leave. Well, I'll tell you this. What's interesting is around the world, a lot of other countries get way more leave and it's paid. There are countries that you get like 6 months for pregnancy in particular, 6 months at full pay.
The dad does even.
Yeah.
Over in the Scandinavian countries especially, they get that much off.
Right. They believe in taking more vacation time too. We're not very much like that, right? And family medical leave also gets paternity leave, and Brian points out you got 10 days from the Army, and paternity leave, and in the U.S. it could be the same 12 weeks. You can take that whole time off. Most employers aren't going to pay you for the full 12. Usually, you have to exhaust your sick and annual leave, or sick or vacation time. You can use it. Most employers let you use that against it to be paid during that time and all that stuff. In any event, you get the idea. But we're not the best. I mean, we're pretty low on the totem pole about whether or not we offer very good leave compared to a lot of places in the rest of the world. So anyway, that's there. I'll point out the two different types of sexual harassment that you hear. The one is the Latin phrase quid pro quo. You know what that one is, right? Yeah, something for something, which means is that basically you're asking for sex for job, right? Or some promotion at your job. Okay, that one is pretty straightforward. I mean, we pretty much know when that happens. Not always. Doesn't mean it's easy. This whole area is difficult. It's the easy one to prove, or a lot easier to prove than the hostile work environment. Now, hostile work environment, you will from time to time in any employment you have, you'll say, this is a hostile work environment, okay? Because you don't like your boss or whatever is bad. You just don't like it. It feels hostile. But that isn't what hostile work environment means legally. It only means that it's related to some kind of gender discrimination. Okay, you are being singled out or made to be in a hostile environment or an uncomfortable environment because of the sexual orientation, okay, of the gender issue.
I looked at the federal statute for that, and it also can be created if your employer knows you filed a claim of discrimination and they treat you poorly because you did file an initial complaint with the EEOC. So go either way.
Right, which those are whistleblower acts that protect you from those kinds of things. But yeah, you can't be treated, you're not supposed to, but so I'll tell you this, that's the most common type of sexual harassment. It's also the most difficult to prove and the least successful in terms of being tried because there are lots of, it's just hard evidence. I mean, it's a lot of people say things. The common case when this first was like a big deal in the law, and you would start when it first became like a topic of discussion, was people that had in their office like the pinup girl calendars in their office, and the guys would pass around the swimsuit issue and stuff like that in the office. It was that kind of stuff that people kind of got to laugh at, like, oh, that's fun. And then it was like, well, is that really discrimination? That's just guys being guys, right? And the reality was that environment, and that's where it came from. So it has to be a repetitive thing that happens. A single incident does not make a hostile work environment, by the way. Okay? So all of that, I want to zoom back up to another point, and that's the gender pay gap. Okay? Everybody knows that you all are aware of this concept, right? What is the gender pay gap? Basically, women make 70 cents on the dollar compared to men,
The glass
right?
ceiling.
Right? Partly of that, you have promotional ability and all those things. So we can talk about the gender pay gap if you want. It's an interesting point. It's very hard to get a solid number on what that actually means. Okay, if we take all payroll across the U.S., we will get a gender pay gap. Okay, that's where the 70 cents on the dollar comes from. Okay, you understand that concept? Okay, so if we take all payroll data and we say men versus women, we will get that women make 70 cents, or 70% of what men do. Okay, how do we fix that problem? Okay, and what do they do?
They make laws, but they're also susceptible to lobbyist groups, so.
But I mean, doesn't the Civil Rights Act cover that?
Does it?
I mean, you're not supposed to treat people differently on the basis of gender.
It only covers part of that.
Well, what part does it not cover?
It doesn't specify. Well, I'm trying to remember because I read it. It matters if it comes down to severance. I know that part does matter. Like if you get a severance package, you can't be treated differently because of your sex.
Right.
That way. I'm not sure how.
But that's easier calculation, right?
Right. But I'm not
Because
sure
you're
how
saying
it's
you're being departed from employment. We set a scale for that, and we say you can't be like, all right, both of you have worked here 10 years, and everyone that has worked here 10 years gets 10 weeks pay at 10%, and then it's like, oh, the women get 7,
Right.
right?
Right. But it's
Like you can't do that. That was a little easier to figure out. Easier to legislate too. Be like, well, clearly that has to be the same. You set up a formula. You don't really care who they are. You put those people in the formula and spit them out, and they all get paid the same. But is the gap the same? I mean, we're talking about equal pay for equal job, right? How do we compare that data?
I think it should be a merit system, personally.
Okay.
Are we under a merit system in this country?
In some employers, definitely, right? Certainly.
But then,
Do we only have that?
but on the
What
other
is a
side-
merit system?
But on the other side of the coin, you've got affirmative action, which I think is.
Can't have it. Okay, affirmative action.
I think it's kind of silly. I really think it defeats the purpose. They're trying
So
to
we equalize. So you're talking about legislation that equalizes these things.
Yeah, but I don't know. I just feel like it should be more merit-based and less affirmative action. I would be more offended to be hired just because I was a woman than because of what I could do. I'd rather be dismissed for not having the qualifications than to be kept on just because I'm a woman.
But what we're saying in a lot of the issue has always been that you don't get the job at all. Yeah, like no chance. We will always hire the man over the woman.
Maybe then, but not now. I don't believe. Maybe in some. I just don't believe that that's the same thing.
I'll tell you this. I know how I think as just a normal person that goes out, and maybe it's the way I grew up or whatever. The women in my family worked probably twice as hard as the men, and the men worked hard. So don't get me wrong. To me, it makes no sense. Gender pay gap makes no sense to me. I think it's crazy. I can't say that why should my mom make less than my dad in the same job. It doesn't make any sense to me. But every day you hear some crazy story about what people actually do, right? The longer you work with an employer, the more stories you'll hear. of what you're like, what? They said that, right? Or they did that. Okay. So anyway, the gender pay gap. So I'll tell you, one time I was judging a debate, and it was I forget what kind it was called. It's part of the like speech and debate team, and they had a competition here, and so I was judging it, and it was the type of speech where it's basically like a legal argument. It was pretty cool. It was like they get a subject, they get enough time to research it, like not very long. Everything's timed in speech and debate, and they come in and oh, their topic was pulled out of they could cancel out certain ones. They were like, you get like 10, and one side gets to get rid of 3, and the other side gets to get rid of 3, and then the one gets to pick one. Okay.
Like extemporaneous speaking.
Yeah, and it was pretty cool. So it's like you just come out and you're really giving a legal argument basically. So these two females, they are against each other, and the one I'm judging. They get down to gender pay is their issue, and I think the position statement was that women make less than men, or something like that. And I'm like, okay, so these two walk in here and they tell me what the debate subject is, and I'm like, this is going to be hard. How do you argue against that? Right? And particularly if you're both females. I'm thinking this is going to be a tough argument. So I'm watching, and the one is just like the one that starts out and has the pro, which is, yeah, they paid less and it's not right. And she's just going. I'm like, well, I'm writing down notes. I'm like, point. The other one gets up and I'm like, what is she going to say? I'm like, how is she going to combat any of that stuff? And we're sitting there, and I'm thinking, oh, and she pauses a while at first, and then she comes up with the whole thing that basically there's no proof that it's anything less than, it's not comparing apples to apples, that it's not, we don't have numbers on equal pay for equal work. We don't have the number. All we can take is the entire, that was her argument. That's a pretty dang good argument. She took about half the time the other one, and she couldn't say anything else about whether or not it wasn't right. Now it's not right that women get paid less than men for, generally that's bad, right? She agreed with all that. I agree with all the things she said. I thought, I was amazed. I was like, that was a heck of an argument. I would have never come up with it. Anyway, those debates are fun. If you ever do them or get a chance to judge them, they're kind of fun. Okay, I want to move to the next area, which is any questions about any of the gender and employment, right? We know about the protections, and the practice is what's complicated. All right, so moving into the next area, this plays in pretty heavily, and it's sexuality and reproductive rights. And I want to point out a couple things. First of all, contraceptives. Do you all understand that it wasn't until 1972 that you had the right to use a contraception? Right? You weren't allowed to. It wasn't, states could outlaw it till then. What? Why? Why could they outlaw?
Because families need more tax money.
Okay, so we need more people, so we have a larger tax base.
Is that wrong?
Now we have to.
Okay.
Right?
So you think, well, that wasn't the Roe versus Wade case, but contraception wasn't even available. But only a year later, we get Roe versus Wade in '73 that says that states can't totally outlaw abortion, only in particular areas, right? We'll talk about that in a second. Let me get back to, so contraception, that is a thing. You didn't get that right till the 1970s, all right? So kind of an interesting point. The next one is states were allowed to sterilize folks by law.
Yes.
Okay? Who could they sterilize? Generally, the infirm, who they called the feeble-minded. The feeble-minded. Oh, there's the buzzword or the key word for today is feeble. What? Feeble is the key word. Okay. The feeble-minded. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, a very well-respected jurist, by the way, he says in a case involving he referred to it this way, that the it was the daughter of the feeble-minded daughter of a feeble-minded mother in the same institution who had already given birth to a feeble-minded child. He said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and they allowed the sterilization of her. Okay,
Wow.
that's what 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Sounds
Well,
like
you know
some
what?
sound logic.
These days,
Yeah.
So the point is, sterilization was legal. The court said it was, right? We know the courts made mistakes from time to time, right?
and if they didn't sterilize them, they lobotomize them,
Well, and then there's a Kennedy to that.
right? Whereas Mary Kennedy, it was,
Okay, so anyway, those didn't work out as well as they thought, the science on that one, right? Sounds good. I mean, it seems just natural. Just take some of their brain. That won't cause any other issues.
vegetables.
Just make it work, right? You won't be crazy anymore, right? You just won't be. Okay. So so going back then to the right, the abortion, right to abortion in Roe versus Wade, I think really you need to know 2 things. One, Roe versus Wade is the one we know of that legalizes abortion, right? And it uses what we call the trimester approach. Okay. What is the trimester? What is a trimester?
The first 3 months, it's composed of 3 months. You have the first 3, second 3, and the last 3.
Okay, what was the law of trimester then?
It's developmental. It's according to development, right?
Okay, so the state of science, right? So the state of science at Roe versus Wade, they come up with the trimester approach in the legal sense to say what generally about, you guys know what they said generally about the trimesters? Can a state outlaw abortion in the first trimester? Yes, right? That's what it said. The second trimester, what can a state outlaw? They can outlaw abortion, but it must leave an exception for what? The health of the child or the health of the mother. Okay, in the third trimester, what can they do? What can a state outlaw? Abortion, but with the exception of the mother. Okay, so if you're going to lose the mother, then abortion's okay. They can outlaw only with that exception. Okay, does that mean that all the states went out and legalized it to the fullest extent of Roe versus Wade? No, they didn't. Some states did not do that. Some other states, Texas, one of the most notable ones, that's where Roe versus Wade comes out of. And I don't know if you all know what the history of who was actually Miss Roe, right? Miss Roe, that's a fictitious name, isn't it? You know that? Jane Roe. Okay. You know what happens over her history subsequent? Of course, by the time it got to the court and everything, she'd already had the baby. Okay. So she has the baby. I think she gives the baby up for adoption. But what happens to her? Do you know what happens to her? She becomes a staunch pro-life advocate. Okay. Anyway, so her namesake case, I suppose her name wasn't Roe, really. I forget what it was, but she had become a pro-life person. Anyway, so Roe versus Wade sets out the trimester approach. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is actually the law today, sets up the other way to look at it, and it's the viability law. What is viability?
Being able to survive outside the womb.
Right. So viability. So in other words, by the time we get to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, we have new state of science. The state of science says, what is basically viability today? What do we know to be viability?
Well, that they can either exist on their own or with artificial support.
Okay. And about how long is that?
What is that, 37, 30? What's the standard? The earliest is
They don't want you to deliver before 38 weeks.
37, 38.
But what is viability? Viability is way earlier than that.
Yeah, it's 25 maybe?
Well, for a time, and then it got down lower. I think they've had a case of a child that lived under 20 weeks.
18, I think, was the always have known.
So what does that mean? Does that mean in every single case that the viability is at 18 now? No, that's not what it means. It means that the state of, that at that point, this viability, whatever it is in that particular case, okay, the state of science, whether or not the child could survive. Okay, so in other words, that's the point. Well, we thought for a long time that was about 20. There's no less than 20 was viability, or no more than 20, or no less than 20 was viability. So that's where the law became. Okay. Just,
Is every state, so is that a cookie cutter law for every?
no, the laws all have different things.
That's what I was gonna say. Do you know what West Virginia's is?
No, because they just pass one. It got, I can't remember. We don't really have very many abortion clinics.
Right, I would think we'd be very,
You can't, I think, for instance, you can't, I don't think you can get an abortion in Wood County. I don't think you can.
well, I'm saying, I think we're pretty conservative in that way.
Yeah, but I think we have them. It's illegal to some level.
Planned Parenthood still has a foot in here though.
Right, sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, and anyway. But you can't do that in Wood County, I'm pretty sure. I don't think you can get an abortion. In any event, so those issues are out there. That's all women's rights and legal rights of women and all those things. Some laws in the abortion area have all kinds of effects. Some of them require like court approval. Some of them require notification of the father, or at least if you're married, then it has notification of the husband. If you're under 18, there's notification, and there's waiting periods that states have enacted, because they're saying we're not outlawing it. We're saying you have to wait 3 days, or you have to be explained in great detail all the consequences. States have passed laws where you have to watch a video of one being performed and seeing the fetus and all those things. Like, that's laws that the states have passed to say that's within Planned Parenthood, is what they're saying. Have they largely held up the challenge? I don't know. Probably about 50-50.
Question.
Yeah.
I know this is really volatile, but I'm asking anyway. So one of the big arguments for pro-abortion is that if the mother is
We
raped,
call that choice.
pro-choice, sorry, let me be correct on that. That the woman who is forcibly raped should be able to get rid of that. But then on the other side, I think of the child that had no choice either in the matter. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It seems like that
So-
there's a bit of a.
So you're saying like in some states have had exceptions for, children conceived by rape.
Right. What I'm saying, is it fair then to depend on.
Well, that's the argument. That's the argument
It's not his or her fault.
on either
that
side.
It was conceived.
Right. So the child isn't at fault. So in other words, there's an exception for.
The exception.
There's an exception sometimes for, the conception during rape as a result of rape, and then, well, okay, so you're allowed to abort, or you're permitted by law to abort that baby, that fetus, but really, is that the child's
Right.
fault?
That's
No,
what I'm
that's a lot of the debate, to be honest with you. So I don't know. We won't go. We can't. That is a pretty big argument. But that's a big piece of it, and some states have now said that that's not it, but that you can't, and then some others have said yes. So there's been both ways on that. Okay, so that's no fun. That subject is pretty
Yeah, sorry about that. That was
pretty
a little bit-
controversial, but that's all right. I mean, that's part of law. I mean, that's where it's a law thing. Something that's this is not also not a real friendly area, but I think that you ought to know about this in domestic violence, and particularly in the civil domestic violence protective order area. You ought to know how to get one. If you all don't know how to get one, you should. Okay. I'm not saying that I hope you'll ever have to use it. I hope you don't. But if you ever do, you ought to know how to get one. So do you all know how to get one if you live in West Virginia? You got to go down to the magistrate court in the county where you are at the time. And that can mean as little as one evening you can get it. So if let's say you live in Ohio and with your domestic partner, whoever that is, there's a list, there's a definition in the statute, but basically who is your domestic is any family member by blood, so your parents or marriage, okay? Blood or marriage are any family member, so your brothers and sisters, your aunts, uncles, your parents, your grandparents, your kids, they're all domestics. Okay. Also, any person you have a child with is a domestic, whether they live with you or not. Anybody you live with is a domestic. Okay. So anybody you live with. Okay. That doesn't mean that necessarily you are sexually intimate with them. It just means that you live with them, which leads you to another one. Anyone you are sexually intimate with is a domestic. Okay. So all of those people are domestic. That means that you can file a protection order against them if they have committed an act of domestic violence against you or have put you in real fear that you will be physically harmed. Okay? You may also protect your children or minors through this process. You may go and file on behalf of your child or a grandchild or a sibling, even if they're under 18 and you're not their parent, you can protect them.
But you have to be over 8.
You do, yes. Okay, so you can get those. Where do you go in West Virginia? You go to the magistrate court in the county where you are. So we're right now in Wood County. Let's assume we all live here. You would go to the Wood County Magistrate Court and you would go in. They're going to have self-help forms. They're going to show you how to do it. You're going to get what's known as an emergency domestic violence protective order. Okay, they will hear it. It's one-sided. We call that ex parte in the law. You're going to present your side. The magistrate's going to decide whether or not that meets, they'll say probable cause, but I don't know if that necessarily is the term for this, but that's what they'll say, that there's enough evidence to believe that there was domestic violence or the threat, the real threat or perceived threat of real physical harm. Then they'll grant it. What immediately happens, then you'll be set in to go to family court for a full hearing. The other side will be notified and they can come. In the meantime, that usually has to happen within 10 days. You are protected by that order. Okay? That sounds great, right? But it's a piece of paper.
Right.
Okay? It's a piece of paper. So if the person still wants to get you, it's still good to get the paper. You know why?
Legal protection?
Because when you call 911 and you say, I have a protective order, they won't ask any other questions. They'll start coming. Okay, they may still ask you questions, but they're going to start coming. They're not going to delay. They will start coming to help you. Okay, and that can make the difference. So just keep that in mind. Don't think that it's not going to be worth anything. Okay, just realize that. Don't think it's not going to be worth anything. You never know. But the fact that you can start with saying, I have a protective order and he or she is here, that is enough to get 911 to send them.
I would think it'd be easier if you did have minor children involved to convince a judge. Do you know what I mean? That's
Sure.
necessary to get one of these.
Sure. I don't know. I would say, generally speaking, you can't abuse these very easily. Do they err on the side of caution? Probably, right? But you get them. You go to family court. You don't need a lawyer to do it. Because it's in family court, they'll also deal with any child custody issues, who gets to stay at the house, car, things like that. They deal with all those things when you go. But just point that out. You ought to know how to get one. Okay, how do you get one in Ohio? You go to the municipal court. And they will do the same thing. They'll have the forms. It'll have a little bit broader definition of who you can get one against, except that it's a little bit more difficult to get it because it's not just like a domestic, just because you live with the person doesn't necessarily mean you get one, but it's a little bit broader, okay? So know how to get them if you need one. I think you should know how to get one.
These are only temporary, right?
The original one's temporary. It's civil. If a person violates a civil domestic violence protective order, that is a crime, okay? So that's one level of it. Typically, you get your emergency one in magistrate court. You'll go to family court, and they will last 90 to 180 days, okay? Same, in Ohio, it's the same time frame. Basically, it must be federal law that designates some kind of level of benefits that the states get, so they need to basically the same law. In West Virginia, you can also get what's called a personal safety order, which protects you against stalking and harassment of non-domestics. Okay, I don't know if you know that. You get that in magistrate court too. So that would be a non-domestic. And more than one incident of stalking harassment. It has to be more than one. Okay, what does that mean? If you think it's stalking harassment, it probably is. Okay. All right. By the way, they're civil. They don't go on your criminal record. They don't go anywhere, quite frankly, unless you violate it, then it becomes a crime.
I think with social media, a new meaning is given to the word stalking and harassment, or could be,
Yeah,
will be in future legislative
sure.
actions.
I think you can be stalked or harassed there now, according to
Yes,
the law.
absolutely. But it has
No, I
to
mean,
be-
according to the law, I think you would
Oh,
still get
really?
protection. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I thought we
It'd be
had-
hard to prove, but a little bit harder to prove than, somebody's following you and things like that.
But it could be proved with a paper trail and
Yeah,
electronic
sure.
trail.
Whether you couldn't block it off and things, whether the court will get involved would be the bigger question. Okay, so let's go just a couple more issues in domestic violence. In the criminal side, if 911's called, in some states they now have, if 911's called or the cops are called for domestic violence, they have a mandatory arrest provision. Okay, what does that mean? Somebody's getting handcuffed and gone.
And it's probably not gonna be the one with order.
It won't necessarily be the one with the order, right? Probably never going to be. But who is it going to be? I don't know. I've seen them both all the way,
Really.
for that matter. But mandatory arrest, why did we implement these things in domestic violence? Because there's also the mandatory prosecution that we're still going to bring the case. The second thing that happens, so we arrest you, we charge you, now the trial comes, it's time to go to the magistrate court and have your misdemeanor trial. And guess what? The victim doesn't show, right? They don't prosecute the case. So in some states, we don't have that in West Virginia. They will institute a mandatory prosecution. That means the state's still going to bring it without the witness, okay? We're going to bring the case, then the witness isn't there. How successful do you think such a case is?
No.
The victim to domestic violence isn't testifying. You think it's very successful? No, but it doesn't let you just walk away and think, oh, I've convinced the person not to come. So why do they have those provisions?
Because they don't want it to be toothless, right? They want that paper to mean something.
Okay, so they want there to be some teeth to the law on that.
There's so many women that when they bring one of those orders, they
Right.
drop it, or they'll
They
use
get
it,
intimidated.
or they'll use it to get the man in trouble, even though he doesn't. That's
Right.
actually true.
The idea is to curb abuse, right? In part. On one side of it, you have women who will use it to get the man in trouble, and it can go the other way. But you'll have that happen. You call, you're going to get the cops there because we know the cops respond to these. They're going to show up, and then when the cops get there, the other thing that happens. So one is for trouble, and the other piece is that once the cops get there, it's like, oh, everything's okay now. I didn't really mean it. He didn't do anything, or she didn't do anything. We're good, right? And then guess what happens later? Another incident. Because it wasn't true. It was like, oh, now that it's real, he or she's going to be really mad now, which actually leads us into the next level, which is the battered women syndrome, which is a related concept that you will deny the abuse because of fear of more abuse, right? And all of that. So you have those issues. Those come up. We have a lot of them. I mean, there were a lot of DVs, criminal DVs, where no one shows up for the hearing. There are a lot of civil DVPO hearings where no one shows up, or the guy does. I mean, it tends to be overwhelmingly one's accused. Okay, we could go into a whole class on that probably. But in any event, we are also realizing today that for a long time the law has been prejudiced against giving these kinds of protections to men, saying they're the abuser, they're not the one that's abused, right? And the judges would tend to be like, wow, you're faking it. Like, there was a guy, I was at a conference once, and it was a family judge who did tons of these, because that's what they do, a lot of these when you're in a family court. He said that I'm sitting there, and this guy comes in, he's this big guy, and he's probably 6'3" or something, and he files the protective order, and we're sitting in there, and I look over, and his wife is a shorter lady, was real pleasant and mild and everything. And he said, I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, this can't be like, he claimed a bunch of things that like she was like, he was really fearful and that she was gonna, kick his butt and all this stuff. He's like, I'm just not buying it. I can't imagine how is she gonna beat him up. And he said at that same time I was about to decide, her phone starts ringing, and the ringtone was, I'm gonna kick somebody's ass. Have you ever heard that ringtone? And he says, I went, granted. Anyway. But, there is a bias that says, like, men can't be the domestic abused person.
Or is it more that they don't want, because of pride, they don't want to admit to it?
There's factors of that too. But it's, there's lots to that whole area. Okay? All right. So that's it. Don't forget, there's going to be the third quiz. I also, in the meantime, sometime in the next week or so, I'm going to give you the course project. It'll be in there, so you can start working on it. It's sort of for the end. And so that's it. Okay? There was a safe word. Kill me with the safe word. Yes, there was a safe word. It was called feeble. Feeble. Feeble-minded. Okay. See you next time.
It's just people right now. People find it.
Right.